When effort becomes resistance, something subtle but powerful is happening beneath the surface of your life. And most people never notice it. They assume that if things are not changing, the answer must be more discipline, more force, more pressure, more trying. Try harder to think positively. Try harder to visualize. Try harder to stay motivated. Try harder to fix yourself. And yet the more they push, the heavier everything feels. The results do not speed up. They slow down. Opportunities feel distant. Desire feels strained. Life begins to feel like something you are wrestling instead of something that is responding to you. Here's the part that is difficult to hear, but deeply freeing once it lands. Effort is not the same thing as alignment. Effort is not proof that something is working. In many cases, effort is the signal that you believe something is missing, that something is not here yet, that you are behind, that you need to force reality to cooperate. That belief, quietly running in the background, is what turns effort into resistance. Resistance is not anger or fear alone. Resistance is tension. It is urgency. It is the feeling that something must change soon or else. It is the internal pressure to make life give you what you want, instead of allowing yourself to move in harmony with it. You can meditate and still be in resistance. You can affirm and still be in resistance. You can take massive action and still be in resistance. Resistance has nothing to do with what you are doing on the outside. It has everything to do with the state you are operating from on the inside. Think about how the body works. When you strain a muscle, it tightens. Blood flow decreases. Movement becomes restricted. Healing slows down. The same principle applies to your inner life. When you strain for outcomes, when you grip your desires too tightly, when you monitor progress with anxiety, you constrict the very channels through which change naturally moves. Life does not open under pressure. It opens under coherence. Most people were taught the opposite. They were taught that effort equals virtue, that struggle equals growth, that if something feels hard, it must be meaningful. And while effort has its place, effort without clarity becomes noise. Effort without trust becomes interference. Effort without alignment becomes a form of self-opposition. You are not pushing life forward. You are pushing against it. There is a moment many people recognize only in hindsight. A moment when they stopped trying so hard and things unexpectedly shifted. They stopped chasing a conversation and the call came. They stopped obsessing over money and an opportunity appeared. They stopped forcing confidence and suddenly felt steady. These moments are not accidents. They are demonstrations of a deeper law. Life responds to state before it responds to action. This does not mean you do nothing. It means you stop doing things from panic. It means you stop acting from the assumption that you are behind. It means you stop making effort your identity. Action taken from strain carries a very different signal than action taken from stability. One communicates lack. The other communicates readiness. One says something is wrong. The other says something is already aligned. Here is where effort quietly turns into resistance. When your actions are fueled by the belief that this moment is insufficient, that belief becomes the lens through which everything is filtered. Even progress feels fragile. Even success feels temporary. Even good news is followed by the question of how long it will last. The nervous system never relaxes, and a system that cannot relax cannot receive. There is a reason clarity often arrives in moments of stillness, in the shower, on a walk, right before sleep. Not because effort stopped entirely, but because tension dropped. When tension drops, perception widens. When perception widens, intelligence has room to move. Life is not withholding solutions from you. It is waiting for you to stop drowning them out with internal pressure. Effort becomes resistance when it is rooted in mistrust. Mistrust of timing, mistrust of yourself, mistrust of life. And that mistrust creates a constant need to manage, control, and accelerate. You check the outcome repeatedly. You scan for signs. You measure where you should be by now. You replay mistakes. You rehearse fixes. All of that activity feels productive, but it is actually reinforcing the assumption that nothing is settled yet. What if the real work is not pushing forward, but stabilizing inward? What if the shift is not more effort, but cleaner effort? Not louder action, but quieter certainty. Not force, but coherence. This is not about becoming passive. It is about becoming precise. When effort is guided by inner alignment, it feels different. It feels grounded. It feels obvious. It feels timely. It does not require constant motivation because it is not fighting against anything. As we move forward in this conversation, you are going to start seeing where effort has been used as a substitute for trust, where trying has replaced clarity, where doing more has replaced listening deeper. None of this is about blame. It is about recognition. Because once you see where effort turns into resistance, you can stop leaking energy there. And when energy stops leaking, things begin to move with far less force than you ever imagined was possible. Once you see how effort turns into resistance, the next question naturally arises. How did effort become the default in the first place? Why do so many people feel like they have to strain for outcomes that are supposed to feel natural, fulfilling, and alive? The answer is not because they are doing something wrong. It is because they were trained to equate control with safety. Somewhere along the way, effort stopped being a tool and became armor. Most effort is not about creating results. It is about managing fear. Fear of falling behind. Fear of missing out. Fear of wasting time. Fear of not being enough. So effort becomes a way to stay busy, to feel responsible, to feel like you are holding things together. But effort driven by fear never produces freedom. It produces vigilance. And vigilance keeps the nervous system locked in a low-level state of stress, even when things appear to be going well. This is why so many people feel exhausted even when they are making progress. They achieve something, but instead of relief, they feel pressure to maintain it. They reach a milestone, but immediately wonder what comes next. The effort never ends because the internal state never resolves. When effort is used to compensate for inner instability, it multiplies work instead of reducing it. There is a subtle difference between disciplined movement and compulsive effort. Disciplined movement comes from clarity. It knows where it is going and why. Compulsive effort comes from uncertainty. It is constantly checking itself, correcting itself, justifying itself. One feels clean, the other feels heavy. One restores energy, the other drains it. Pay attention to how your body responds to effort. True alignment does not create tightness in the chest. It does not create a knot in the stomach. It does not create shallow breathing. When effort is aligned, the body remains open. Breathing stays steady. Attention stays present. When effort becomes resistance, the body contracts. Shoulders rise. Jaw tightens. Thoughts race. That contraction is not motivation. It is a warning signal. Many people assume that letting go of effort means losing ambition. In reality, it means losing distortion. It means removing the emotional noise that makes simple actions feel monumental. It means separating desire from desperation. Desire is clean. Desperation is noisy. Desire moves you forward. Desperation pulls you apart. This is why effort often increases right before burnout. People sense that something is off, so they double down instead of slowing down. They add more routines, more techniques, more rules, more pressure. But pressure does not resolve misalignment. It amplifies it. You cannot force your way into coherence. Coherence happens when internal signals stop contradicting each other. Think about how clearly you function when you trust something is handled. You do not micromanage it. You do not obsess over it. You do not constantly intervene. Your energy stays available for what actually matters. That same principle applies inwardly. When you trust your direction, effort becomes lighter because it is no longer burdened by self-doubt. Here is a practical distinction that changes everything. Ask yourself before taking action, am I moving from clarity or am I moving from discomfort? Clarity feels settled even when it involves challenge. Discomfort feels urgent even when it involves something small. If the impulse to act comes with tension, rushing, or inner pressure, pause. That pause is not avoidance. It is recalibration. This does not mean you wait forever. It means you allow the action to reorganize itself around a steadier state. When you act from steadiness, timing improves. Conversations land differently. Choices become cleaner. You stop overcorrecting because you're no longer trying to escape the present moment. Effort becomes resistance when it is used to outrun discomfort instead of understand it. When you slow down enough to feel what is actually driving your actions, effort naturally adjusts. It becomes proportionate, it becomes intelligent, it stops being reactive. As we continue, you will begin to recognize that the real shift is not about doing less, but about removing the inner friction that makes everything feel harder than it needs to be. When that friction dissolves, effort no longer blocks results. It becomes the quiet extension of alignment instead of the barrier standing in its way. Once effort loosens its grip, something unexpected begins to surface. Awareness. Not the kind of awareness that analyzes or criticizes, but the kind that notices without tension. This is where real change starts. Not at the level of action, but at the level of perception. When you stop forcing movement, you finally see what has been shaping your behavior all along. Most resistance does not come from the outside. It comes from an internal argument that never resolves. Part of you wants change. Another part of you is afraid of what that change implies. Effort becomes the mediator between those two parts, a way to keep moving without actually deciding. But unresolved inner conflict leaks into everything you do. It fragments attention. It drains energy. It turns simple steps into exhausting negotiations. This is why awareness matters more than motivation. Motivation pushes. Awareness clarifies. When you clearly see why you are doing something, the unnecessary effort drops away on its own. You stop adding tension to actions that only require presence. You stop bracing for outcomes that do not need defending against. Notice how often effort is used to override signals instead of listen to them. Fatigue, hesitation, irritation, distraction. These are not flaws. They are feedback. When ignored, they harden into resistance. When acknowledged, they soften into guidance. Awareness turns symptoms into information instead of obstacles. There is a quiet intelligence underneath your behavior that does not shout. It nudges. It signals. It adjusts. But it cannot be heard when the system is overloaded with effort. When everything feels urgent, nothing feels clear. When you are constantly trying to improve yourself, you lose contact with yourself. This is where many people misunderstand growth. They believe growth comes from adding more habits, more discipline, more pressure. But real growth often comes from subtraction, removing assumptions, removing false urgency, removing the belief that you must struggle to justify progress. Awareness strips away what was never necessary. Try this practical shift. Instead of asking, what should I do next? Ask, what am I reacting to right now? That question immediately moves you out of autopilot. It reveals whether the next action is coming from alignment or from avoidance. Reaction always carries effort. Alignment carries direction. Another simple practice is to slow your internal timing. Not your external responsibilities, your internal pace. Speak slower in your mind. Move your attention deliberately. Let decisions land instead of rushing them. This does not make you less effective. It makes you more precise. Precision reduces wasted effort. When awareness increases, something else becomes visible. How often effort is used to maintain an identity rather than meet reality. Trying to be productive. Trying to be disciplined. Trying to be successful. Identities require constant upkeep. Awareness does not. It simply responds to what is real. The moment you stop performing for an internal standard, energy returns. Not as excitement, but as steadiness. And steadiness is far more powerful than intensity. Intensity burns fast. Steadiness carries you forward without collapse. As awareness deepens, effort naturally reorganizes itself. You still act. You still choose. You still build. But the actions are no longer loaded with self-correction or inner commentary. They become direct, clean, appropriate. This is the turning point most people miss. They try to replace effort with passivity or force with inaction. That is not the shift. The shift is from unconscious effort to conscious movement, from tension-driven action to clarity-driven action. In the next stretch of this conversation, the focus moves even deeper into how identity quietly dictates effort and how changing the way you see yourself dismantles resistance at the root rather than fighting it on the surface. As awareness settles in, identity becomes impossible to ignore. Not the identity you consciously describe, but the one you quietly live from. This is where effort truly takes hold, because effort is often the labor required to maintain an outdated self-image. When who you think you are does not match where life is trying to move you, effort fills the gap. Identity is not just a label. It is a posture. It is how you brace yourself against the world. If you see yourself as someone who has to try hard to get anywhere, every action will carry weight. If you see yourself as someone who must prove worth, every step becomes charged. Effort becomes the tax you pay to uphold a story about yourself. This is why effort feels endless for some people. They are not just working toward a goal, they are defending an identity. They are trying to confirm something internally through external outcomes. Success then feels temporary because the identity still needs maintenance. The moment results slow down, effort spikes again. Notice how often effort appears when you are trying to become someone rather than express someone. Becoming implies deficiency. Expression implies presence. When action is driven by becoming, it is fueled by lack. When action is driven by expression, it is fueled by clarity. One drains, the other sustains. Here is a practical way to see this clearly. Pay attention to the language inside your head when you feel strain. Phrases like, I need to get there, I have to fix this, I should be further along, all point back to identity pressure. You are not responding to the moment, you are responding to a story about where you should be. The shift begins when you stop asking, how do I get there, and start asking, from where am I acting? That question changes everything. It pulls attention away from outcomes and places it on orientation. When orientation is aligned, movement becomes natural. When orientation is misaligned, effort increases no matter how good the plan is. Identity-based effort also explains why rest does not always restore energy. You can take time off and still feel tired if the identity you return to requires constant vigilance. Rest helps the body. Alignment helps the system. Without alignment, rest only pauses the drain. This is not about abandoning responsibility or ambition. It is about releasing identities that require struggle to feel valid. Growth does not demand self-opposition. It requires self-honesty. When you stop forcing yourself to be someone else, effort relaxes into engagement. One useful practice here is to experiment with identity lightly instead of defending it heavily. For a day, drop the label you normally operate from. Not permanently, just temporarily. Stop being the one who has to hold everything together. Stop being the one who always pushes. Stop being the one who figures it all out. Notice what actions still occur naturally without that pressure. You may find that many things continue to happen, sometimes more smoothly. That is not coincidence. It is proof that effort was supporting an identity, not the task itself. When identity loosens, effort recalibrates. This is also where self-trust begins to rebuild. Trust does not come from pushing harder. It comes from seeing that you can respond effectively without force. Each moment of unforced clarity strengthens confidence in a way effort never could. As identity shifts from something you defend to something you inhabit, resistance fades at the root. Not because you fought it, but because it no longer has a role to play. From here, the conversation moves toward how desire itself gets distorted by effort, and how learning to relate to desire differently allows results to unfold without pressure or delay. Desire itself is not the problem. Desire is neutral. It is information. It is life indicating direction. Resistance appears when desire becomes fused with urgency, when wanting turns into needing, effort rushes in to manage the discomfort of not having. This is where momentum quietly collapses. Notice the difference between wanting something and feeling incomplete without it. Wanting is expansive. Needing is constrictive. Wanting says this would be enjoyable, meaningful, interesting. Needing says something is wrong until this arrives. Effort is born in that second statement. It becomes the attempt to escape the discomfort of incompleteness rather than the movement toward expression. This is why effort often intensifies around the things you care about most. The desire itself is clean, but the emotional charge attached to it is not. The more meaning you pile onto an outcome, the more pressure you feel to force it into existence. Pressure then distorts perception. You stop seeing clearly. You stop responding intuitively. You start overcorrecting. Here is something subtle but important. Desire does not require constant attention to remain active. It does not need to be held tightly. In fact, attention applied too aggressively suffocates it. Think of how creativity works. The harder you try to be creative, the more blocked you feel. When you relax, ideas surface on their own. Desire follows the same principle. Effortful desire tries to monitor progress constantly. Is it working yet? Am I doing enough? Did I miss something? That monitoring keeps the nervous system in a low-level stress response. From that state, action loses precision. You may still move, but the movement is noisy, scattered, inefficient. A practical shift here is to separate desire from timeline. Desire points to direction. Timeline introduces pressure. When you collapse the two together, effort explodes. You start acting as if delay means failure rather than unfolding. When you allow desire to exist without demanding immediacy, your system stays open and responsive. Ask yourself this honestly. Do I want this because it feels aligned or because I am trying to relieve tension? The answer matters. When desire is used to escape discomfort, effort becomes compulsory. When desire is honored as direction, action becomes cooperative. Another place effort sneaks in is comparison. Watching how quickly others receive what you want can create artificial urgency. Suddenly, your desire is no longer personal, it is competitive. That competition fuels effort, not alignment. You begin trying to keep up rather than listening inward. Desire rooted in comparison rarely resolves satisfaction, even when achieved. There is always another benchmark, another person ahead, another metric. Effort thrives in that environment because identity and worth are constantly being negotiated externally. Try this experiment. The next time desire arises, do not ask how to get it. Ask how it feels to imagine having it calmly. Not excited, not relieved, calm. Notice what changes. If imagining. Fulfillment creates ease rather than tension. Desire is clean. If it creates pressure, desire has been entangled with lack. From calm desire, inspired action emerges naturally. It feels obvious. It feels timely. It does not require constant self-correction. From pressured desire, action feels forced, strategic, anxious. The body always knows which is which. Effort is not removed by suppressing desire. It is dissolved by clarifying relationship to desire. When desire stops being a problem to solve and becomes a direction to listen to, resistance loses its function. This brings the conversation closer to the role of control and how the attempt to manage outcomes through effort often blocks the intelligence that already knows how to move things forward efficiently. Control often disguises itself as responsibility. It sounds mature, it sounds disciplined, but underneath it is usually fear. Fear that if you do not manage every variable, things will fall apart. Effort feeds on that fear. It convinces you that constant intervention is necessary, that relaxation equals risk, that trust is naive. The truth is that most of the intelligence guiding your life does not come from conscious control. Your breathing, digestion, emotional regulation, intuition, pattern recognition, all of it operates without effort. The moment you try to manually override these systems, efficiency drops. Yet this is exactly what happens when you attempt to control outcomes through force. When effort becomes dominant, you stop collaborating with reality and start wrestling it. You try to bend events into shape rather than responding to what is actually unfolding. This creates friction, not because reality is opposing you, but because you are no longer synchronized with it. There is a difference between participation and interference. Participation means you respond to signals as they appear. Interference means you act before information's fully arrived. Effort tends to interfere. It rushes timing. It fills silence prematurely. It creates action to avoid uncertainty rather than to express clarity. Look at how often effort shows up as micromanagement of your own process. You question every decision. You replay conversations. You second-guess instincts. You override impulses because they do not fit the plan you are trying to enforce. In doing so, you disconnect from the very guidance that would move things forward smoothly. Control-driven effort also collapses adaptability. When you are overly attached to a specific path, you miss better routes. You ignore feedback. You push through resistance instead of reading it. Resistance is information, not an enemy. But effort trained you to treat it as something to overcome, rather than something to interpret. A practical shift here is learning to distinguish between clarity and compulsion. Clarity feels settled. It does not rush. It does not argue. Compulsion feels urgent and loud. It pressures you to act immediately, often without full understanding. Effort aligns with compulsion, not clarity. Notice how often you equate stillness with stagnation. When nothing is visibly happening, effort panics. It demands motion. But stillness is not absence. It is integration. It is recalibration. It is the phase where unseen alignment takes place. Forcing movement during that phase disrupts coherence. This is why people often sabotage momentum just before breakthroughs. The system is reorganizing. New information is settling. Instead of allowing that process to complete, effort intervenes. It pushes. It overacts. It fractures timing. Try this approach instead. When you feel the urge to control, pause. Ask yourself what information might still be arriving. Ask what would happen if you waited slightly longer before acting. Waiting is not avoidance when it is intentional. It is respect for timing. Effort tells you that without pressure, nothing moves. Reality demonstrates the opposite every moment. Growth unfolds naturally when conditions are right. Your role is not to force conditions, but to remain receptive to them. As control softens, something unexpected happens. You do not become passive. You become precise. Actions become fewer but more effective. Words land better. Decisions align faster. You are no longer exhausting yourself trying to steer the river. You are learning to read its current. This prepares the ground for understanding how ease is not the absence of action, but the absence of internal friction, and how results often accelerate the moment you stop trying to make them happen. Effort also distorts your relationship with time. When you are forcing outcomes, everything feels delayed. You measure progress constantly. You check for signs. You look for confirmation that what you are doing is working. This monitoring creates tension, and that tension pulls your attention out of the present moment. You are mentally living in the future, waiting for relief instead of allowing momentum to build where you are. When time becomes an enemy, patience disappears. And without patience, wisdom cannot operate. Many of the most effective shifts in life happen quietly, incrementally, and beneath the surface. Effort does not like subtlety. It wants dramatic movement. It wants proof now. So it dismisses small signals and overlooks gradual alignment, even though those are the very processes that produce lasting results. This is why effort often leads to burnout rather than fulfillment. You expend energy trying to compress time, but time cannot be bullied. When you stop fighting the pace of things, energy returns. Not because you are doing less, but because you are no longer leaking energy into resistance. There is also an identity component here that is rarely acknowledged. Effort becomes a way of proving worth somewhere along the way. Many people learn that value comes from struggle, that if something feels easy, it must not be legitimate. So effort becomes performative. You push not because it is required, but because it reinforces the belief that you are deserving through exhaustion. But reality does not reward effort. It responds to alignment. You can work relentlessly in the wrong direction and get nowhere. You can take one aligned step and experience rapid movement. The difference is not morality or discipline. It is coherence. Ask yourself how often you are acting from the belief that you must earn outcomes through strain. That belief keeps effort locked in place. It prevents rest from feeling safe. It prevents ease from feeling trustworthy. It creates a loop where you never allow yourself to arrive. A useful practice is to separate action from self-worth. Before taking a step, check your motive. Are you acting because something feels clear and appropriate, or because you feel anxious if you do not act? Anxiety-driven action rarely produces clean results. It muddies communication. It introduces unnecessary variables. It creates consequences you then have to manage. This does not mean you wait endlessly. It means you learn to act from stability rather than urgency. Stability allows you to hear subtler signals. It sharpens discernment. It improves timing. And timing is everything. Notice how many problems dissolve when they are no longer chased. Relationships improve when pressure is removed. Ideas mature when given space. Opportunities surface when you stop hunting for them. This is not coincidence. It is the natural response of systems that no longer feel constrained. Effort wants guarantees before trust. Life asks for trust before guarantees. That is the reversal most people resist. Yet every meaningful expansion you have ever experienced likely required a moment where you stopped forcing certainty and allowed something unknown to unfold. As effort loosens its grip, you start relating to uncertainty differently. It becomes a field of possibility instead of a threat. You stop filling silence with noise. You stop crowding potential with expectation. You allow room for intelligence beyond your current understanding to move. This is where results begin to reorganize themselves, not because you are trying harder, but because you are no longer in the way. When effort releases, something else becomes available that effort could never provide: clarity. Clarity does not arrive through pressure. It arrives when the nervous system settles enough to perceive accurately. Many people believe they lack discipline or consistency when what they actually lack is calm. And without calm, even the best intentions become distorted. Clarity changes how you interpret feedback. Instead of taking every delay as a failure, you begin to see timing as information. Instead of reacting emotionally to obstacles, you read them as signals. This shift alone alters outcomes dramatically because you are no longer fighting what is happening. You are learning from it in real time. Effort tends to collapse perspective. Everything feels personal. Every setback feels like proof. Every pause feels like rejection. When effort relaxes, perspective widens. You see patterns instead of problems. You see cycles instead of blocks. You recognize that movement is not always forward in a straight line. Sometimes it deepens before it advances. This is where intuition becomes reliable again. Intuition cannot speak over noise. It cannot guide someone who is frantic to control outcomes. When effort steps back, intuition does not shout. It becomes obvious. Certain actions feel unnecessary. Certain choices feel complete before they're taken. You start trusting what feels settled instead of what feels urgent. One of the most practical shifts you can make here is to stop acting at the peak of emotional intensity. Whether that intensity is excitement or fear, it clouds judgment. Pause long enough for the charge to dissipate. What remains afterward is usually the correct move. This alone can prevent months or years of unnecessary struggle. Another change that occurs is how you relate to desire itself. Desire no longer feels like a problem to solve. It becomes a direction, not a demand. You stop asking when and start asking how it wants to move through you. That question produces far better answers than force ever could. Notice how often you confuse motion with progress. Doing more does not mean aligning more. Alignment often looks like fewer actions taken with greater precision. Effort loves volume. Alignment prefers accuracy, but when accuracy increases, effort naturally decreases. You may also begin to notice resistance leaving areas of life you were not actively working on. This happens because effort was never localized. It was a state. When the state shifts, multiple systems reorganize simultaneously. Energy that was tied up in proving, defending, and chasing becomes available for creation. This is where life starts responding differently. Conversations soften. Decisions resolve faster. Opportunities appear without announcement. You find yourself less reactive, less defensive, less compelled to explain yourself. None of this comes from strategy, it comes from coherence. The deeper truth here is that effort was never the engine. It was the compensation. When the underlying state changes, the need to compensate disappears. What remains is movement that feels obvious rather than exhausting, and progress that feels stable rather than fragile. By this stage, you're no longer asking how to make things happen. You're learning how to stay out of the way long enough for them to unfold. At the end of all of this, what becomes clear is that the shift was never about doing something new. It was about stopping something familiar. You stopped gripping, you stopped pushing. You stopped trying to force life to respond on your timeline. And in that space, something more intelligent than effort finally had room to operate. This is why so many people work hard for years and feel like they're always almost there. They're not blocked by lack of action. They're blocked by the inner posture they bring to that action. When action is driven by fear of not having enough, not being enough, or falling behind, it carries resistance no matter how disciplined it looks on the surface. When effort becomes resistance, the solution is not to quit. It is to soften, to let your sense of worth detach from outcomes, to let your identity stop hinging on whether something arrives today or later. This does not make you passive. It makes you accurate. Accuracy is what allows results to stabilize. When you move from clarity instead of pressure, you stop overshooting. You stop sabotaging timing. You stop creating cycles where you build something only to burn out right before it matures. You begin to sustain what you start. One of the most overlooked truths about manifestation is that life responds to your relationship with uncertainty. When uncertainty feels threatening, effort increases. When uncertainty feels neutral, intelligence takes over. You begin to move with conditions instead of against them. That cooperation accelerates outcomes in ways effort never could. You may notice now that the things you once obsessed over no longer carry the same charge. Not because you stopped wanting them, but because wanting no longer feels urgent. Urgency dissolves when trust replaces control. And trust is not blind faith. It is lived evidence that you function better when you are not at war with the process. From here forward, the work is simple, but not always easy. Notice when effort spikes. Notice when urgency creeps in. Instead of doubling down, pause. Ask what you're trying to protect or prove. Then let that soften. Every time you do this, resistance loosens and coherence returns. This is not about mastering manifestation. It is about removing the friction that was never required in the first place. Life does not need to be wrestled into cooperation. It responds naturally when your internal state is steady, grounded, and open. When effort is no longer a driver, results stop feeling fragile. Progress stops feeling temporary. And you realize that the moment things began to change was not when you pushed harder, but when you finally stopped blocking what was already trying to arrive. That is the quiet truth most people never hear. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it.